You don't feel guilty because you're selfish. You feel guilty because, somewhere along the way, you learned that choosing yourself meant someone else would suffer. You feel it in the smallest moments. When you say no, even politely, your chest tightens. When you rest, your mind searches for something you should be doing instead. When you prioritize your needs, a quiet voice inside whispers, "Who are you disappointing right now?" You may not even consciously think this. It's more like a background hum, a subtle tension, a low-grade anxiety that appears the moment your life stops, revolving around others. And what makes this so confusing is that on the surface, you look strong, responsible, reliable, emotionally intelligent. You're the one people lean on, the one who handles things well, the one who doesn't need much. But here's the paradox no one ever names. The very trait that once kept you safe, your ability to minimize yourself for others, is now the thing slowly draining your life of joy, rest, and authenticity. You didn't choose this pattern because you lacked self. You chose it because it worked. At some point, probably early, you realized something crucial. Being easy was safer than being honest. Being helpful was safer than being needy. Being low maintenance was safer than being real. So you adapted. And now, years later, your nervous system still reacts as if choosing yourself is dangerous. As if love is something you could lose at any moment if you take up too much space. This video is not about selfishness. It's about survival. It's about understanding why self-care feels like guilt, why boundaries feel like cruelty, and why choosing yourself feels less like freedom and more like abandonment of others, or worse, of who you were taught to be. Psychologically speaking, this pattern is most often rooted in parentification. Parentification occurs when a child is placed, emotionally or practically, into a caregiving role too early, not necessarily through dramatic neglect, but through subtle expectation. You may have been the emotional regulator in your family, the peacekeeper, the one who sensed tension before it was spoken. You learned to scan the emotional environment, the way sailors scan the horizon constantly, unconsciously, instinctively. This creates hypervigilance, a nervous system trained to prioritize external stability over internal truth. Your body learned a rule before your mind ever did. My needs are secondary. My awareness keeps people safe. Neurologically, this reshapes how the brain allocates attention. The default mode network, the system responsible for self-reflection, becomes hijacked by relational monitoring. Instead of asking, "What do I feel?" your mind asks, "What do they need?" Over time, this creates what attachment theory calls conditional belonging. Love becomes something you perform for. Connection becomes something you maintain through effort. And authenticity becomes negotiable. You weren't taught to be selfish. You were taught to be necessary. And when your worth is built on being necessary, choosing yourself doesn't feel empowering. It feels like dereliction of duty. There is a grief here that rarely gets acknowledged. The grief of the life you could have lived if your nervous system hadn't been trained to equate love with sacrifice. You learned early that belonging required adaptation, so you adapted endlessly. You softened your edges. You delayed your needs. You swallowed your resentment and called it maturity. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents." But there is another burden too, the unlived life of the child themselves. You sacrificed authenticity for attachment, and while it kept you connected, it slowly disconnected you from yourself. The core fear beneath the guilt is not selfishness, it's abandonment. A primitive fear that says, if I choose me, I will be alone. If I stop being useful, I will be unwanted. If I rest, everything will fall apart. This is why joy feels suspicious, why ease feels temporary, why happiness is often followed by anxiety. Because somewhere inside, you're still bracing, waiting for the cost of choosing yourself to arrive. These patterns don't disappear with age. They mature. They disguise themselves as personality traits. You might over-explain your boundaries so no one feels hurt. Feel responsible for other people's emotions. Stay in relationships where your needs are minimized. Struggle to receive care without discomfort. Confuse self-sacrifice with love. Feel uneasy when life is calm, as if something must be wrong in careers. You become indispensable, but exhausted. In relationships, you become understanding, but unseen. Internally, you become composed and quietly resentful. But none of this is who you are. These are coping strategies, and healing doesn't begin by shaming them. It begins by witnessing them, by saying, "This helped me survive, but I don't need it anymore." Unlearning is not rebellion. It is recalibration. It's teaching your nervous system that safety no longer requires self. Healing begins with reparenting, learning to give yourself what was once conditional, rest without justification, boundaries without apology, needs without narrative. This is not about becoming selfish. It's about becoming integrated. Jung also said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Choosing yourself will feel wrong at first, not because it is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. Guilt is not a moral signal. It is a memory, and every time you choose yourself anyway, you rewrite the contract you were never meant to sign. You were never meant to earn your existence. You were never meant to disappear to be loved. You don't need to be fixed. You need to be whole. And wholeness begins the moment you stop asking, "Who will this hurt?" and start asking, "What do I need to stay alive, fully alive?" If this resonated, share it with someone who still feels guilty for resting. And remember, choosing yourself is not abandonment. It is finally coming home.